The invitation had come with conditions. Not written ones, those were polite and standard but understood ones. A live television appearance. A full audience. A host known for sharp turns and sharper humor. The kind of setting where moments were manufactured in real time and reputations could be nudged, reshaped, or quietly tested. Anthony Hopkins understood all of that before he ever agreed. He agreed anyway. The studio was loud long before the cameras rolled. Warm-up laughter. Music cues. Stagehands moving with practiced urgency. Hopkins sat in his chair off to the side. Hands resting on his knees, posture relaxed. He wasn't reviewing notes. He wasn't rehearsing lines. He was simply present. The host noticed that immediately. Guests usually arrived with a nervous energy, checking reflections, adjusting jackets, leaning into small talk to settle themselves. Hopkins did none of it. He watched, listened, waited. That kind of calm, unsettled people whose job depended on steering the room. 2 minutes, a producer called. Hopkins stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the stage. Applause swelled as his name was announced. He acknowledged it with a nod, nothing more, and took his seat across from the host. They exchanged greetings. The opening minutes went smoothly. They talked about craft, about longevity, about discipline. Hopkins answered thoughtfully, briefly, never trying to steal the spotlight, never offering sound bites. The audience leaned in. The host smiled, relaxed. Then the shift came. It always did. So, the host said, leaning forward slightly, voice dropping just enough to signal a turn. You've been praised for your intensity. Some people even find it intimidating. A ripple of laughter. Hopkins smiled faintly. I've heard that. But, the host continued, others say you hide behind seriousness, that you never really let people see the real you. More laughter, this time edged with expectation. Hopkins didn't react. Is that intentional? The host asked. Or is it just habit? The audience chuckled again. Hopkins considered the question, not theatrically, not defensively. Then he answered. I'm not hiding, he said. I'm just not performing comfort. The laughter faltered. The host blinked. Comfort. Yes, Hopkins said. It's something audiences are often offered. I don't always see the need. The host laughed, louder than necessary. Well, this is entertainment. Hopkins nodded. It can be many things. The applause was uncertain now. Polite. Curious. The host sensed it and adjusted, leaning into humor, exaggerating ease. Come on. Surely you enjoy loosening up sometimes. Joking around. Letting your guard down. Hopkins looked at him steadily. My guard isn't up. The crowd quieted. That's hard to believe, the host said lightly. You've built a career playing men who dominate rooms. Hopkins tilted his head. I've built a career listening. A murmur moved through the audience. The host smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Listening to what? Hopkins didn't rush. What isn't being said? The pause stretched longer than planned. The host shifted in his chair. This wasn't the rhythm he'd intended. He'd expected charm, deflection, maybe a witty counter. What he was getting instead was something heavier, something that slowed the room down. So let me ask you directly, the host said, voice sharpening just a touch. Do you think you're above playing along? Hopkins' expression didn't change. No, he said. I think I'm responsible for what I bring into a room. The audience was silent now. That sounds very serious, the host said, attempting levity. Almost moral. Hopkins smiled faintly. Only if you think seriousness is a flaw. The line landed harder than the host expected. He tried to recover momentum. People tune in to be entertained, not lectured. Hopkins nodded. Then it's fortunate I'm not lecturing. Then what are you doing? The host asked. Hopkins met his gaze, answering honestly. The applause came this time without prompting. Not thunderous but genuine. The host laughed, but there was a tightness to it. You really don't give me much to work with. Hopkins leaned back slightly. I'm giving you exactly what's there. That was the moment the control room noticed something was wrong or right depending on perspective. The host had tried to challenge him, to tease out discomfort, to put him slightly on the defensive for the audience's amusement. Hopkins hadn't taken the bait. Worse, he hadn't resisted it either. He'd reframed it. So you're saying, the host said, choosing his words carefully now, that people misunderstand you? Hopkins shook his head. I'm saying people project onto silence. Another murmur. The host glanced at the camera, then back at Hopkins. And you don't feel the need to correct them? No, Hopkins said. Because correction invites argument. Presence doesn't. The room felt different now. Slower. Heavier. The audience wasn't laughing or clapping. They were listening. The host attempted one last angle, smiling broadly. You know, some might say this makes you seem unapproachable. Hopkins smiled, not unkindly. Approachability is a performance too. That was it. The line didn't insult the host. It didn't embarrass him. But it exposed the mechanism of the show itself, gently, unmistakably. The audience sat still. The host swallowed, then laughed. Well, he said, we'll have to agree to disagree. Hopkins nodded. Of course. They moved on. The segment ended shortly after. The remaining minutes filled with safer questions, lighter ground. But the energy never fully returned to what it had been. When the applause signaled the end of the show, it was strong. But it carried something else with it. Recognition. Backstage, the producer exhaled. That was unexpected. Hopkins thanked the crew quietly, shook hands, and collected his coat. As he walked down the corridor toward the exit, a stagehand called out softly, Sir, thank you. Hopkins turned. For what? For not making it ugly, the stagehand said. Hopkins smiled faintly. It didn't need to be. He left the building without looking back. Inside the studio, the host sat alone for a moment longer than usual, staring at his desk, replaying the exchange in his head. He hadn't been humiliated, but he had been outpaced. Not with wit, not with dominance, with calm. The audience had seen it. The crew had felt it. And the moment had already escaped the room, traveling outward intact. What Hopkins had done wasn't dramatic. That was why it was devastating. And the meaning of it, why the room had gone so quiet, would only become clearer once people began talking about what they'd witnessed. Not a confrontation, a contrast. And the story, though the cameras had stopped rolling, was far from finished. The clip didn't go viral the way confrontations usually do. There was no shouting, no walk-off, no headline-ready insult. That was what confused people at first. Viewers who caught the broadcast live found themselves unsettled rather than entertained. They replayed the moment not to laugh, but to understand why the room had felt so still afterward. Something had shifted, and it hadn't shifted back. By the next morning, the segment was circulating quietly online. Not clipped aggressively. Not framed with reaction emojis. Shared with captions like, "Watch closely," or simply, "This is interesting." Media commentators tried to describe it and struggled. Awkward, one said. Uncomfortable, another offered. Unexpectedly profound, a third tried. None of those words quite fit. Because what had happened wasn't awkwardness, it was exposure. The host had done what hosts often did. He'd nudged, teased, pressed gently but publicly, assuming the guest would respond in kind. Humor for humor. Performance for performance. Instead, Anthony Hopkins had removed himself from the exchange without leaving his chair. That was the unsettling part. He hadn't escalated. He hadn't withdrawn. He'd simply refused to play. Back in the studio, the host rewatched the segment alone later that week. Not for ratings, for comprehension. He noticed things he'd missed in the moment. How Hopkins never interrupted. How his tone never sharpened. How every response was anchored in something internal, not reactive. The host realized, uncomfortably, that there had been no moment where Hopkins was trying to win. That made the usual tools useless. Sarcasm had nowhere to land. Charm found no surface. Provocation dissolved before impact. It wasn't that Hopkins had dominated the conversation. He'd made domination irrelevant. The host mentioned it privately to a colleague. "I didn't feel attacked," he said. "I felt revealed." The colleague nodded. That's worse. Audience reactions mirrored that confusion. Some viewers felt defensive on the host's behalf. Others felt oddly grateful. A surprising number commented on the silence after Hopkins' lines rather than the lines themselves. Why did it feel like he slowed time? I didn't agree with everything he said, but I couldn't stop listening. That wasn't an argument, it was a boundary. That last comment stuck. A boundary. That was the word people kept circling without realizing it. Hopkins hadn't corrected the host. He hadn't contradicted him directly. He'd clarified what he was and was not available for. That clarity resonated beyond the segment. Actors talked about it privately. Some admitted they wished they could do the same, stop performing relatability on command. Others confessed they wouldn't dare, because there was risk in refusing to entertain. The industry rewards flexibility, agreeableness, the ability to bend tone on demand. Hopkins had done the opposite, and nothing bad had happened. That was the uncomfortable lesson. Days later, the host addressed the moment indirectly during another show. Sometimes, he said lightly, you invite a guest expecting a conversation, and you get a mirror instead. The audience laughed, unsure whether they were meant to. Hopkins, meanwhile, said nothing. He didn't comment publicly. He didn't clarify his intent. He didn't share a perspective piece or accept follow-up interviews to explain what he meant, because explanation would have undone the point. When asked weeks later by a journalist whether the exchange had been tense, Hopkins replied simply, "No. It was precise." "What do you mean by that?" the journalist pressed. Hopkins smiled. "Tension is unresolved energy." There was nothing unresolved. The journalist tried another angle. "Do you think the host felt challenged?" "I can't speak for him," Hopkins said. "I felt calm." That was the end of it. Behind the scenes, producers quietly adjusted how they booked guests like Hopkins. Fewer attempts to manufacture moments. Less reliance on playful disrespect as a hook. Not because Hopkins had demanded it. Because the room had felt the cost when someone didn't accept the premise. And once that cost is felt, it's hard to ignore. Months later, a younger actor referenced the interview during a panel discussion. "I realized watching that," he said, "that I don't have to answer the version of me people bring into the room." The moderator raised an eyebrow. "You think you can get away with that?" The actor smiled. "Not yet." That was the difference. Hopkins could do it because he wasn't proving anything. He wasn't protecting a brand. He wasn't defending relevance. He was protecting alignment. Alignment between who he was and what he was willing to offer publicly. That alignment read as authority. Not the loud kind, but the kind that doesn't flinch when questioned. The real reason the crowd had been stunned wasn't because Hopkins had delivered a devastating line. It was because he demonstrated something rare on live television. That you can remain open without being exposed. That you can be present without being performative. That you can answer honestly without turning honesty into spectacle. Most people didn't know how to process that in real time. So they sat quietly. And that quiet carried weight. The segment was eventually archived like any other. Buried among thousands of interviews, thousands of exchanges. But people kept returning to it. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was clean. No loose ends. No unresolved conflict. Just a clear demonstration of what happens when someone refuses to confuse accessibility with authenticity. Anthony Hopkins had been challenged publicly on television. And instead of countering the challenge, he'd removed its foundation. The crowd hadn't been stunned by what he said. They'd been stunned by what he didn't do. He didn't explain himself. He didn't apologize for his tone. He didn't bend to make the room comfortable again. He let the room adjust to him. And that adjustment, subtle, quiet, undeniable, was the real ending. Not applause. Not triumph. But a studio full of people realizing they just witnessed a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. The kind that doesn't need to. That was the moment.